The CIA told his father he was dead. His father, a man who rarely showed emotion, locked himself in a dark room and wept. But Frank Snepp wasn't dead. He'd made it out of Saigon on one of the last helicopters. What he witnessed in those final hours, and what he chose to do about it afterward, would turn him into the most controversial whistleblower in American intelligence history and transform the First Amendment forever. Frank Warren Snepp was born on May 3, 1943, in Kinston, North Carolina. His father was a man of few words, emotionally distant, the kind of person who kept his feelings buried deep. Frank would later describe their relationship as complicated, marked by long silences and unspoken expectations. But young Frank had something burning inside him, a restless intellect and an idealistic belief in America's place in the world. He studied Elizabethan literature at Columbia University, graduating in 1965. Think about that for a moment. This wasn't someone who dreamed of becoming a spy or an analyst. He was a student of Shakespeare, of poetry, of the intricate dance of words and meaning. Yet the world in the mid-1960s had other plans for young men like Frank Snepp. Snepp was recruited to the CIA in 1968 by Philip Mosley, the Associate Dean of the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University. The Cold War was raging. Vietnam was tearing America apart, and the CIA was looking for bright young minds to help fight an ideological battle that spanned continents. Snepp signed on with the Central Intelligence Agency, brimming with love of country and a desire to defeat communism. Initially, he worked on NATO and European security. But in 1969, everything changed when he was sent to Saigon, Vietnam. The very word still carries weight, doesn't it? It was the conflict that defined a generation, split families, ended careers, and left scars that America still feels today. In Saigon, Snepp worked as an analyst and counterintelligence officer, coordinating agent networks and interrogation of captured enemy forces, as well as preparing strategic estimates regarding the enemy. This wasn't desk work thousands of miles away. This was real, on-the-ground intelligence gathering in one of the most dangerous and complex environments imaginable. For 5 out of his 8 years as a CIA officer, he worked as interrogator, agent debriefer, and chief strategy analyst in the United States Embassy in Saigon. Most CIA officers rotated out of Vietnam after 2 years. The stress, the danger, the moral weight of the work, it took a toll on everyone. But Snepp rejected the usual 2-year rotation and stayed in Vietnam until the U.S. was forced out in 1975. 6 years. He chose to stay for 6 years in a war zone because he believed in what he was doing, and because he had formed bonds with the Vietnamese people who were risking their lives alongside America. And here's where we need to understand something crucial about Frank Snepp's identity. He wasn't some cynical operative just collecting a paycheck. He remains very much the patriotic American who first landed in Vietnam, delighted that nothing would ever matter so much as what I did here. He genuinely believed that America's cause was just, that protecting South Vietnam from communist takeover was worth the sacrifice. But after a few years on the ground in Vietnam, Frank Snepp became convinced that the United States could not win. The intelligence he was gathering, the strategic estimates he was preparing, they painted a picture that Washington didn't want to see. The South Vietnamese military was struggling. Corruption was rampant, and the North Vietnamese were patient, determined, and ultimately more committed than anyone in Washington seemed to understand. What troubled Snepp, even more than the military reality, was what he saw happening to the Vietnamese people who had trusted America. These weren't just abstract allies. They were interpreters, informants, agents, real human beings with families who had put their lives on the line because they believed America would protect them. Snepp was deeply concerned that the local population that had colluded with the United States would meet a horrible end if the agency did not work to protect them. He tried on various occasions to communicate this concern to his superiors, but his pleas went unanswered. This is where the conflict in Frank Snepp's story really begins. Not on a battlefield, but in meeting rooms and classified cables. He was seeing the storm coming and trying desperately to get someone to listen. Then came 1975. The fall of Saigon was the capture of the capital of South Vietnam by North Vietnam on April 30, 1975. This led to the collapse of the South Vietnamese government and the evacuation of thousands of U.S. personnel and South Vietnamese civilians, and marked the end of the Vietnam War. The rapidity with which the South Vietnamese position collapsed in 1975 was surprising to most American and South Vietnamese observers, and probably to the North Vietnamese and their allies as well. Everything fell apart faster than anyone predicted. A memo prepared by the CIA and U.S. Army intelligence, published on March 5, indicated that South Vietnam could hold out through the current dry season, at least until 1976. These predictions proved to be grievously in error. By April 27, Saigon was encircled by 100,000 North Vietnamese troops. The end was coming, and it was coming fast. Operation Frequent Wind was the final phase in the evacuation of American civilians and Vietnamese from Saigon, South Vietnam, before the takeover of the city by the North Vietnamese. It was carried out on April 29–30, 1975, during the last days of the Vietnam War. More than 10,000 Vietnamese thronged around the U.S. Embassy, frantic for a seat on the helicopters that flew from rooftops to a fleet of 26 U.S. ships offshore. The chaos was unimaginable. People were desperate, terrified of what would happen when the North Vietnamese arrived. Many Americans felt that they had a responsibility to evacuate the Vietnamese people who had worked for the U.S. government and military. The Americans knew that if they left these loyal people behind, they faced imprisonment, hardship, and even death at the hands of the North Vietnamese. The Frequent Wind Plan aimed to evacuate about 8,000 U.S. citizens and third-country nationals, but it was never able to estimate the number of South Vietnamese to include. There were about 17,000 at-risk Vietnamese on embassy rolls, which, using an average of 7 dependents per family, meant that the number requiring evacuation was 119,000. Think about those numbers. 119,000 people who had trusted America, who had worked alongside Americans, who were now facing an uncertain and terrifying future. As a one-time lead strategy analyst at the CIA station in Saigon, Snepp interrogated top prisoners and intelligence sources, personally delivered the president of South Vietnam to his own evacuation flight out of the country, and was among the last 17 CIA officers to be lifted off the roof of the U.S. Embassy. Snepp was on hand for the fall of Saigon and was one of the last Americans to leave the U.S. Embassy before the city fell to the North Vietnamese on April 30, 1975. Snepp was evacuated with other American personnel in Operation Frequent Wind. But here's what was happening back home during those final chaotic hours. It was April 1975, and CIA operative Frank Snepp had gone missing, or so the agency told his family. The CIA had made a terrible mistake. They thought he hadn't made it out. Snepp's father, famously stoic and distant, locked himself in a dark room and wept when he learned of his son's fate. This man, who rarely showed emotion, who kept everything bottled up inside, broke down completely at the thought of losing his son. But it soon turned out that Snepp was not missing. The CIA had been mistaken. He had made it out on one of the last helicopters to leave Saigon. In a way, That mistake about his whereabouts briefly reunited the estranged father and son. But the tension between them continued. That difficult relationship paralleled the one he had with his superiors at the CIA. Each was to haunt him for years to come. While Frank Snepp returned home, his Vietnamese associates suffered a less kind fate. As with countless other Americans baptized in the fires of Vietnam, Snepp's pain intensified after he left the battlefields behind. For years, memories of his lost friends and colleagues haunted him. On his return to the U.S., Snepp was awarded the Intelligence Medal of Merit in December 1975. The CIA recognized his exceptional service. He had done everything right. He had served with distinction in one of the most difficult assignments imaginable. But the medal meant nothing to Snepp compared to what had been lost. He resigned from the agency in January 1976, upset at its refusal to rescue Vietnamese left behind in the pullout, and its refusal to acknowledge mistakes made. The CIA wouldn't admit what had gone wrong. They wouldn't acknowledge the people who had been abandoned. And for Snepp, who had formed real bonds with those people, who had looked them in the eyes and made promises that America didn't keep, the silence was unbearable. Prior to publication, and while still employed at the CIA, Snepp attempted to tell the Inspector General about the problems surrounding the evacuation, but was told that it could not deal with anything so controversial. He tried to go through proper channels. He tried to do things the right way. The door was slammed shut. This is the moment of choice that defines Frank Snepp's entire story. He could have walked away. He could have taken his medal and his memories and disappeared into private life like so many others. But after a long struggle, Snepp decided to go public with the story. In 1977, he published Decent Interval, an insider account of the end of the war and the Saigon evacuation. It was published without prior approval from the CIA Publications Review Board. Widely regarded as a classic on the Vietnam War, Decent Interval provides a scathing critique of the CIA's role in and final departure from that conflict. Still the most detailed and respected account of America's final days in Vietnam. The book was written at great risk, and ultimately at great sacrifice, by an author who believed in the CIA's cause, but was disillusioned by the agency's treacherous withdrawal, leaving thousands of Vietnamese allies to the mercy of an angry enemy. The book ignited a firestorm of controversy, was featured in a 60 Minutes exclusive, and received front-page coverage in the New York Times. America was finally hearing what really happened in those final days from someone who was there, someone who had seen it with his own eyes. But the CIA was not going to let this stand. After the book was published, CIA Director Stansfield Turner pushed for Snepp to be sued, and despite the objections of some Department of Justice officials, Turner prevailed. Since publication of the book could not be stopped under the constitutional law forbidding prior restraint of the press, the CIA sued Snepp for breach of contract. Snepp was accused of violating the non-disclosure agreement he had signed when he joined the agency that forbade publication of any material about CIA operations without the prior consent of the agency. Here's what makes this case so remarkable and so troubling. In this case, Snepp admittedly breached his duty to submit the manuscript of his book to the CIA for pre-publication review. However, the government has conceded that the book contains no classified, non-public material. Read that again. The government admitted that Snepp hadn't revealed any classified information. Not a single secret. The book contained nothing that threatened national security. Ironically, President Jimmy Carter permitted the lawsuit against Snepp. At the same time, he had proposed the creation of a special unit to provide protection for civil service whistleblowers. In a press conference, Carter said that Snepp did not qualify as a whistleblower, as he did not reveal anything that would lead to an improvement in our security apparatus or the protection of American civil rights. Snepp enlisted the help of the American Civil Liberties Union in his defense. Both sides had extensive legal teams, because the American Civil Liberties Union and the Authors League of America came to Snepp's assistance. In an extremely rare procedure, the Supreme Court decided to consider the case, but the court made its decision solely on the basis of the papers filed by both sides. There was no hearing, no oral arguments, no chance for Snepp to stand before the highest court in the land and make his case. The justices decided his fate based on paperwork alone. The Supreme Court decision in Snepp v. United States, 444 U.S. 507, 1980, established that government employment agreements requiring employees to submit their publications for prior review do not violate public employees' free expression rights. It also determined that those employees who attempt to ignore or evade these pre-publication review requirements may suffer financial repercussions. The court ruled 6-3 against Snepp on all counts. The CIA won a court verdict against Snepp, with the U.S. Supreme Court ruling that Snepp's book had caused irreparable harm to national security due to creating an appearance of a breakdown of discipline in the CIA. Not actual harm to national security, an appearance of breakdown in discipline. The government admitted the book contained no secrets, yet claimed it caused irreparable harm. The royalties from Decent Interval, amounting to $300,000 by the time Snepp lost in front of the Supreme Court, were surrendered to the CIA, and Snepp was forced to clear all future publications with the CIA. Every word he would ever write about his experience, for the rest of his life, would have to be approved by the agency he had criticized. The court granted the government unprecedented and drastic relief in the form of a constructive trust over the profits derived by Snepp from the sale of the book. Because that remedy is not authorized by any applicable law, and because it was most inappropriate for the court to dispose of this novel issue summarily on the government's conditional cross-petition. For certiorari, Justice Stevens respectfully dissented. In the wake of Snepp's harrowing experiences, his legal case has been used by Presidents Reagan, Bush, and Clinton to narrow the First Amendment freedoms of all federal employees, especially whistleblowers. Snepp described the court decision as a ticking time bomb, which exploded when the cigarette manufacturer Brown and Williamson used the precedent to force CBS not to air an interview with whistleblower Jeffrey Wigand. The Snepp case became a weapon that corporations and government agencies could use against anyone who dared to speak out. But Frank Snepp's story doesn't end with defeat. In 1980, following the Supreme Court decision against him, Snepp became an investigative journalist, contributing to publications including the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Village Voice. His subsequent exploits as a Peabody award-winning investigative journalist working for all three broadcast networks, including ABC's 2020, and in various print and online media, have helped rewrite the meaning of many headline events of the past 30 years, from the Iran-Contra affair to the Monica Lewinsky scandal. At World News Tonight, he got Eugene Hasenfus to confirm that he had signed a government secrecy agreement, confirming the government's involvement in the Iran-Contra affair. The man who had been silenced by a secrecy agreement helped expose another government cover-up. Snepp won an Emmy Award in 1997 for an investigation into Mexican drug trafficking. He won a Peabody Award in 2006 as producer on an investigation for KNBC-TV Los Angeles of a Los Angeles housing development sited on a toxic landfill. The CIA had taken his money, tried to silence his voice, but they couldn't take away his talent or his determination to tell stories that mattered. In 2001, Snepp published a second book, Irreparable Harm, about his court battle with the CIA. The title was deliberately ironic, using the very words the Supreme Court had used against him to tell his side of the story. Snepp wrote in 2009 that he was still haunted by the psychological manipulation and torment of a prisoner he was involved with as a CIA interrogator. Even decades later, the ghosts of Vietnam stayed with him. The choices he made, both good and bad, remained part of who he was. He was a technical consultant for the comedy film Spies Like Us, and was interviewed on his Vietnam War experiences for Ken Burns' series The Vietnam War and Vietnam, The 10,000-Day War. His expertise, his first-hand knowledge, remained invaluable for anyone trying to understand what really happened. Snepp's story might well serve as a reminder to those who would entrust powerful agencies with greater power. In Snepp v. United States, 1980, the Supreme Court enforced the CIA secrecy agreement's per-publication review requirement and applied a constructive trust remedy to Snepp's book profits. The case remains a major reference point in debates about secrecy agreements and the First Amendment. Every government whistleblower who comes after Frank Snepp operates in the shadow of his case. Every federal employee who signs a non-disclosure agreement does so under precedent that his lawsuit established. Remember those thousands of Vietnamese allies who were left behind. Remember the interpreters, the informants, the people who trusted America with their lives. Of the 141,000 refugees evacuated in 1975, nearly all were removed by the United States, and 129,000 were resettled in the United States. Many made it out, but many didn't. And for those who didn't, for those who faced years in re-education camps or worse, Frank Snepp's book was their memorial. It was the record of what America had promised and failed to deliver. Snepp remained very much the patriotic American who first landed in Vietnam. He never became an enemy of his country. He never sold secrets or betrayed his nation. He simply believed that America had to be better than the mistakes it made, and that the only way to be better was to acknowledge those mistakes honestly. The government that awarded him the Intelligence Medal of Merit for Exceptional Service took that same award and used it as evidence of how much trust he had violated. His difficult relationship with his superiors at the CIA entangled him in a legal contest that brought him national notoriety, gathered powerful enemies against him, and challenged the rights of Americans under the First Amendment. And perhaps that's the final irony of Frank Snepp's story. He went to Vietnam to defend freedom. He came home and wrote a book to defend the truth. And the Supreme Court of the United States, the final arbiter of American liberty, told him that some freedoms have limits, limits defined not by what you reveal, but by what you promise not to reveal, even if what you promised to hide was only the government's own failure. Snepp's father, famously stoic and distant, locked himself in a dark room and wept when he thought his son was dead. Frank Snepp survived the fall of Saigon. He survived the Supreme Court. He survived decades of having every word he wrote reviewed by the agency that tried to silence him. But the son that father wept for, the idealistic young man who believed without reservation in America's cause, that Frank Snepp died somewhere between the roof of the embassy and the steps of the Supreme Court. Frank Snepp was one of the first whistleblowers who revealed the inner workings, secrets, and failures of the national security services in the 1970s. He opened a door that others would walk through. Edward Snowden, Chelsea Manning, reality winner, each paying their own price for their own truths. But unlike many who came after, Snepp never fled the country. He never sought asylum abroad. He stayed, fought in American courts, lost, and kept writing anyway. He submitted his work for CIA review as the Supreme Court demanded. even as he continued to expose the kind of government failures that his original book had documented. "We always leave the last war thinking we have all the answers," Snepp once said, "but we end up having more questions.